the true origin of Prohibition, what historians get wrong. Most people think they know how Prohibition happened. They picture a bunch of humorless church ladies with hatchets, a wave of religious moralism that swept the country, and a nation that suddenly decided drinking was a sin. It's a clean story with a clear villain, the preacher, the puritan, the killjoy, and a clear cause. Morality legislation gone too far. But that story is incomplete, and in some very important ways it's just wrong. Prohibition wasn't primarily a religious movement that happened to succeed. It was a decades-long political operation that succeeded because three things lined up at exactly the right moment. A tax loophole finally closed, a war that let reformers turn an entire industry into a symbol of treason, and a lobbying machine so effective it basically invented the modern political pressure group. Remove any one of those three things, and there's a real chance Prohibition never becomes the law of the land. So let's go back, not to January 17, 1920, when the country officially went dry. Let's go back to a Methodist church basement in Oberlin, Ohio, in 1893, because that's really where this story starts. That's where a small group of activists founded the Anti-Saloon League. And if you've heard of Prohibition at all, you've probably heard of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded back in 1874 under Frances Willard, which built the moral case against alcohol for a generation. But the WCTU was a broad reform movement. It also pushed for suffrage, labor rights, prison reform. The Anti-Saloon League was different. It cared about exactly one thing: banning alcohol. And that single-issue focus turned out to be its superpower. The League's chief strategist was a lawyer named Wayne Wheeler, and Wheeler is honestly one of the most underrated political operators in American history. He perfected something historians now call pressure politics, and at the time, people just called it Wheelerism. The idea was simple and ruthless. The League didn't care what party a politician belonged to. It didn't care about any other issue. It only asked one question: will you vote dry or wet? Support Prohibition, and the League delivers votes, money, and church pulpits on your behalf. Oppose it, and the League runs a coordinated campaign to end your career. Wheeler bragged that his organization could bury a congressman's office in tens of thousands of letters and telegrams within days. By the 1910s, most politicians in Washington were simply too afraid of the Anti-Saloon League to cross it. That's not religious revival. That's a modern lobbying machine, decades before anyone else figured out how to build one. But here's the piece almost nobody talks about, and it's arguably the most important one. For most of American history, Prohibition was financially impossible, no matter how many votes the League could deliver. Since the Civil War, the federal government had funded a huge share of its operations through excise taxes on alcohol. By the early 1900s, liquor taxes made up somewhere between 30 and 40% of all federal revenue, second only to tariffs. Think about that. The United States government was more dependent on whiskey and beer than almost anything else it taxed. You cannot ban the product that's paying for a third of your federal budget. It's not a moral question at that point. It's simple arithmetic. That obstacle didn't disappear because Americans got more religious. It disappeared because of the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, which gave Congress the power to levy a federal income tax. For the first time, Washington had another way to fund itself. And once income tax revenue started climbing, it roughly doubled as a share of federal income between 1916 and 1917 alone. The "we can't afford to lose the liquor tax" argument evaporated almost overnight. The dry lobby had been organizing for 20 years. The income tax is what finally made their goal financially survivable for the government. Historians who study this period point out that Congress passed the resolution creating the 18th Amendment in December of 1917, right as income tax revenue was surging past every other source combined. That timing is not a coincidence. And then came the piece that turned a slow-moving campaign into an unstoppable one: World War I. Here's something that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story. Most of the largest breweries in America, Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, Blatz, were founded by German immigrants and still carried German names. When the United States entered the war against Germany in 1917, the Anti-Saloon League and its allies didn't just keep making the moral argument against alcohol. They started making a wartime argument against it. Beer wasn't just sinful anymore, it was German. Drinking it wasn't just a vice, it was practically unpatriotic. One prohibitionist and Wisconsin lieutenant governor put it in language that would be shocking to hear today, declaring that the country's worst German enemies weren't overseas at all. They were the beer barons at home. Propaganda campaigns during the war explicitly linked brewers to treason. Grain that could otherwise go into beer and whiskey was reframed as grain needed to feed American soldiers. And in December of 1917, Woodrow Wilson signed wartime restrictions capping the alcohol content brewers could even produce. Against that backdrop, a constitutional amendment that had been stuck in committee for years suddenly sailed through Congress in weeks and was ratified by the states in just 13 months, one of the fastest ratifications of any amendment in American history. The breweries tried to fight back, buying war bonds, cutting their alcohol content voluntarily, doing everything they could to prove their loyalty. It didn't matter. Once your product was associated with the enemy in the middle of a world war, there was no lobbying strategy that could save you. There's one more thread that rarely gets told, and it involves one of the wealthiest men in American history, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Rockefeller was a lifelong teetotaler, and over roughly 2 decades, he and his father quietly funneled somewhere between $350,000 and $700,000 to the Anti-Saloon League, real money, a serious chunk of the league's operating budget. Some of Rockefeller's own business interests overlapped with this too. He specifically funded the league's Colorado branch around the same time his company, Colorado Fuel and Iron, was dealing with violent labor unrest, and he told an associate directly that those contributions grew out of our large business interests in the state. Rockefeller wasn't alone. Industrialists like Henry Ford supported Prohibition because they believed a sober workforce was a more productive one, and there's actual data to back that instinct up. At Ford's own plants, recorded absenteeism dropped sharply in the months after wartime alcohol restrictions kicked in. For men trying to run an assembly line on a strict schedule, a dry workforce wasn't a moral preference. It was an efficiency upgrade. So by January of 1920, you had 4 separate forces that had nothing to do with each other converging at once. A religious reform movement that had been building for 50 years, a lobbying machine that had perfected the art of political intimidation, a tax system that finally made prohibition financially possible, and a war that let reformers rebrand an entire industry as the enemy. Any one of those alone probably doesn't get you a constitutional amendment. All 4 together made it almost inevitable. Now, here's where the story gets more complicated than the popular version usually allows, and honestly, more interesting. The common narrative is that Prohibition immediately created a nationwide crime wave, invented organized crime out of nothing, and turned every American into a rebellious speakeasy patron. Parts of that are true. Bootlegging and smuggling absolutely exploded, and figures like Al Capone built empires on it. Capone was eventually brought down not for bootlegging itself, but for tax evasion. But historians who have actually dug into the health and crime records from the period paint a messier picture. Death rates from cirrhosis and alcohol-related illness had already been falling steeply before Prohibition even started, as cultural attitudes shifted, and they kept falling through much of the 1920s. Some researchers who have studied crime statistics from the era found that violent crime didn't spike nearly as dramatically as popular memory suggests, and that organized crime existed well before Prohibition and continued well after it, just funded by other rackets. What Prohibition clearly did do, according to Harvard historian Lisa McGurr's research, was fall hardest on specific communities. Enforcement disproportionately targeted African Americans, immigrants, and poor white Americans, while wealthier citizens with private wine cellars and personal physicians willing to write medicinal prescriptions rarely felt the law's teeth at all. And that unevenness matters, because it's a big part of why support for Prohibition eventually collapsed from the very people who had funded it. In June of 1932, John D. Rockefeller Jr., the same man who had spent 2 decades bankrolling the Anti-Saloon League, published an open letter revering his position entirely. He wrote that instead of promoting temperance, Prohibition had done the opposite. Drinking had generally increased, a vast army of lawbreakers had appeared, and respect for the law itself had been badly damaged. Coming from one of the movement's most important financial backers, that letter landed like a bombshell. And then the Depression finished the job that Rockefeller's letter started. By the early 1930s, the country wasn't just questioning Prohibition on principle. It desperately needed the jobs and tax revenue a legal alcohol industry could provide. The same fiscal logic that had helped make Prohibition possible in 1913 now worked in reverse. Franklin Roosevelt signed a law legalizing beer just weeks after taking office in 1933, and by December of that year, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th outright. National prohibition had lasted just 13 years. So let's bring all of these threads together, because the real story of Prohibition isn't a morality tale. It's a case study in how political movements actually win. You had a religious reform tradition that spent 50 years building public sentiment. You had a lobbying organization that pioneered the single-issue pressure politics campaign that basically every modern advocacy group still uses today. You had a tax system that made the policy financially impossible until the income tax quietly removed that obstacle. You had a world war that let reformers reframe an entire industry as an enemy of the state. And you had wealthy industrialists who backed the cause for their own economic reasons, and just as easily abandoned it once it stopped serving those reasons. What historians get wrong when they tell this story quickly is treating it as if a wave of religious feeling simply crested and became law. That framing erases the machinery underneath, the lobbying tactics, the tax politics, the wartime propaganda, and it erases the uncomfortable fact that this moral movement was financed, in large part, by cold economic self-interest. It's also worth sitting with the human side of this for a moment, because that part of the story tends to get lost entirely. Immigrant communities, Irish, Italian, German, and others, watched their social and cultural traditions get legislated into crimes. Working-class Americans without private doctors or hidden wine cellars faced enforcement that wealthier citizens simply never encountered. An amendment sold to the country as a universal moral good ended up being applied selectively, along lines of class and ethnicity, in ways that many of its own original supporters never anticipated and later came to regret. That's really the lesson worth taking from Prohibition, and it's one that still applies today. Movements that succeed rarely do so on moral conviction alone. They succeed when moral conviction lines up with money, timing, and political machinery. And once you understand that combination, you start to see it everywhere in how policy actually gets made, then and now. If you want more of these deep dives into the real mechanics behind the history you were taught in school, subscribing is genuinely the best way to make sure you don't miss the next one. We've got several more of these lined up. And since we've got viewers watching from all over the country, drop a comment and let us know what city or state you're texting from. It's always interesting to see just how far this stuff reaches. See you in the next one.